So the integumentary system includes two major parts. The integument, which is your skin, also referred to as the cutaneous membrane, but it's also going to include various accessory structures, and that would include hair, various exocrine glands, which are glands that secrete local secretions. Remember that glands are a form of epithelial tissue. And then nails. So when we look at the cutaneous membrane or the integument, this is going to consist of two layers. A superficial epithelium referred to as the epidermis. This is the portion that you can actually see. And an underlying connective tissue of the dermis. You also have what's referred to as a subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis. This is technically not part of the skin, as the skin only consists of the two layers, epidermis and dermis. But hypodermis refers to the layer beneath the dermis, and it is typically loose connective tissue. This will separate the integument from the deeper tissues. As I mentioned, it's not part of the integumentary system, yet it is an interwoven as far as, it's the underlying connective tissue for the dermis. So here we can look at our skin, okay? This small segment here where we see many layers of cells, this is going to be the epidermis. This is the basement membrane for the epidermis. And then this is the dermis, this whole layer right here, okay? Again, this is going to be mainly connective tissue, but within that particular layer, you'll see touch receptors, sebaceous glands, some muscles, hair follicles will be rooted, blood vessels. These are all going to be found in the dermal layer. And then down here with the yellow, which is indicating adipose tissue, which again is a type of connective tissue, this is going to be the subcutaneous layer or that hypodermis layer. So there are 5 general functions of the integument or your skin. The first is protection. The skin covers and protects underlying tissues. It also prevents fluid loss. Second main function is temperature maintenance. The skin regulates heat exchange with the environment. If you note that when you are very hot, your skin will become flush and you might even start to sweat a little bit. The third function is synthesis and storage of nutrients. The epidermis will synthesize vitamin D3. This is due to exposure to sunlight or UV radiation. And the dermis stores lipids in adipose tissue. The fourth function is sensory reception. Receptors will detect touch, pressure, pain, and temperature and relay that information to the nervous system for processing. And then finally, the fifth function is excretion and secretion. Glands will excrete salts, water, and organic waste. You also have specialized integumentary mammary glands, which will secrete milk. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different layers here of the skin. The first is going to be the epidermis. This is composed of strata or layers of epithelial cells. Remember that epithelial tissue is avascular, which means it does not contain any blood vessels. That goes true for the epidermis, which is mainly composed up of epithelial tissue. It relies on diffusion from underlying connective tissue for nutrients as well as oxygen. The deepest cells, those that are closest to the dermis, are more active as far as mitosis is concerned. Mitosis is cell division, so this is where you're making all of the new cells. Cells in the outer or superficial layers, these are dead. They are typically filled with protein called keratin, which helps to waterproof the skin. Majority of the cells that we find within the epidermis are referred to as keratinocytes. And again, they're going to contain that protein called keratin. We oftentimes have the reference of skin as either being thick skin as the palms of your hand or thin skin as the tops of your hand if you were to look, or actually the posterior surface of your hand. Thick skin is 5 layers of cells. They're only found on the palms of the hands and soles of the feet. You have a very thick stratum corneum, and the total thickness is about a half a millimeter, or about the size of a standard paper towel. Thin skin is 4 layers of cells, and it covers the rest of the body. The total thickness is about 0.08 millimeters, much, much thinner there. So when we look at the basic organization of the epidermis is going to consist of stratified squamous epithelium. It is going to be separated by the basement membrane. The stratum basale and the underlying dermis are going to interlock, strengthening the bond between the two layers. This interlocking is almost like the egg crate shells that you can see, like those mattress pad egg crate shells. Here you can sort of see how they interwove in with each other. The epidermis forms epidermal ridges, which extend to the dermis and are adjacent to the dermal papillae that project into the epidermis. The function of these dermal papillae, as you can see right here, like one of these sticking up here, this is where the blood vessels are going to come in, so they can help to feed this dermis. I'm sorry, the epidermis layer. So there are 5 strata of thick skin from deep to superficial. The deepest layer is the stratum basale, then you have the spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum. I'm really concerned that you know the basal and the corneum layers. So let's look at the different layers here. The layers of the epidermis are best shown as far as a sectional view of thick skin. Thick skin contains a 5th layer, the stratum lucidum. So thin skin will not have that particular layer of the stratum lucidum. Because thick skin also has a much thicker superficial layer, the stratum corneum, it is about as thick as a standard paper towel, as I mentioned. So let's look at these different layers here. The stratum basale, this is going to be the deepest and basal layer. It is attached to the basement membrane, and it contains the stem cells, melanocytes. Melanocytes will give you pigment to your skin, and tactile cells, which are going to detect pressure. The next layer is the stratum spinosum. These are keratinocytes that are bound together. Then you have the stratum granulosum. The keratinocytes in this layer are starting to now mature, and they will start to produce protein called keratin. Gradually, the plasma membranes will thicken, and the organelles in those cells will disintegrate, and the cells die. The stratum lucidum, this appears as a glassy layer in the thick skin, and remember that's only in the thick skin. And then finally, the stratum corneum, this is multiple layers of flattened, dead, interlocking keratinocytes. These cells have been pretty much filled with the protein called keratin. This is what allows for water resistance to the skin. So again, the next couple slides just go over the various layers that I just went over. So you have the stratum basale again. One thing to mention about the stratum basale is you will see epidermal ridges. These are formed by cells of the stratum basale extending down into the dermis. The dermal projections or dermal papillae extend upward into the epidermis between the ridges. The ridges and the papillae will interlock, increasing the surface area for diffusion and also strengthening the bond between the layers. Contours of skin surface follow the ridge patterns, and this is really the basis for fingerprints or any line markings on the surface of your skin. As you can see here, this is all due to the, epidermal ridges that we find, these line patterns. The various intermediate strata, as we discussed, they're here. There's 3 different layers. And then finally, the stratum spinosum. Looking at each one of these layers, again, we talked about these a few seconds ago. The stratum spinosum, granulosum, and lucidum. Again, the stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin. And finally, the stratum corneum, this is going to contain about 15 to 30 layers of flattened, dead cells packed with keratin. They are called keratinized or cornified cells. These cells are tightly connected by desmosomes. Because of these connections, they are generally going to be shed in large groups or sheets. Now, the cell progression in the epidermis generally takes about 7 to 10 days for a cell to move from the stratum basale to the stratum corneum. In the process, cells will fill with keratin and die. Dead cells stay in the stratum corneum for about 2 more weeks before they are shed away or washed away. Now let's talk about your overall skin color or pigmentation. Keratin and melanin are the two pigments that influence skin color. Keratin is an orange-yellow pigment. It accumulates in the epidermal cells. It is found in orange-colored foods such as carrots and squashes, and it can actually be converted to vitamin A. There are also two types of melanin, red-yellow and brown-black. The melanin is going to be produced by melanocytes. Melanocytes will store melanin in vesicles called melanosomes. Melanosomes enter cells of the stratum basale, coloring the epidermis. The activity increases in response to sunlight or UV exposure. Melanin absorbs UV radiation, protecting DNA in deeper layers of the epidermis and dermis against chromosomal damages, changes that could result in the cell becoming a cancer cell. And here you can see, especially at the bottom picture there, you can see the melanocyte, and you can see the melanin pigments and how they sort of infuse into the skin there. Now, you also have blood circulating throughout your body, including your skin, and oxygenated blood is bright red. Increasing in body temperature dilates the superficial, meaning the blood vessels of the surface, in the dermis. This results in flushed red skin color. Temporary constriction of the same blood vessels results in pale skin. Cyanosis is a bluish coloration, which occurs when blood oxygen supplies are diminished, as in an asthma attack or climbing a mountain that is at high altitude. Now, exposing your skin to sunlight is very beneficial for the main reason that you are going to produce vitamin D. Vitamin D3 is formed by the epidermal cells of certain layers of your skin. It is converted from a cholesterol-related steroid when the epidermal cells are exposed to UV radiation in sunlight. Liver and kidneys will convert vitamin D into calcitrol, the hormone that is essential for the absorption of calcium and phosphorus. Inadequate vitamin D can lead to weak and flexible bones. Now, too much exposure to sunlight could be detrimental, and this can cause various types of skin cancers. Any cancer of the epithelial tissue is referred to as a carcinoma, and there are 3 types. Basal cell carcinoma is the most common skin cancer, and it originates in the stratum basale. Squamous cell carcinoma is found on the more superficial layers of the epidermis. And malignant melanoma is the most dangerous. This usually begins from a mole. It can metastasize through the lymphatic system and can actually cause cancer in various secondary sites. In A, you can see a basal cell carcinoma, and in B, you can see a melanoma. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the dermis. This supports the epidermis. It lies between the epidermis and the hypodermis, and it contains 2 major layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. Here we can see the papillary layer. This is the layer that's closest to the epidermis, and then we have the reticular layer, which is going to compose the rest of the dermis. So the papillary layer of the dermis is named after the dermal papillae. It consists of areolar tissue. It supports and nourishes the epidermis. It also contains capillaries, lymphatic vessels, and sensory neurons that will help to supply the skin surface. The reticular layer of the dermis is an interwoven meshwork of dense, irregular connective tissue. Elastic fibers will provide flexibility. Collagen fibers will limit flexibility, preventing damage to tissue. Dominant cell type is fibroblast in this particular layer. The accessory organs derived from the epidermis, hair follicles, sweat glands, will extend into this layer. It also contains your various blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerve fibers, and sensory receptors. Now, blood supply in the dermis is supplied by a network of arteries called plexuses. You have the cutaneous plexus, which is the deeper layer. This lies along the border of the subcutaneous layer. It supplies the adipose tissue in the hypodermis, as well as the tissues of the integument. The subpapillary plexus, this provides blood to the capillary loops along the epidermis dermis boundary. Okay. Finally, the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. Now remember, this is not part of the skin, but it is deep to the dermis. The fibers are intermixed within the dermis, so there is really no clear boundary. It's not actually part of the integument, as I just mentioned, but it stabilizes the position of the skin relative to the underlying tissues. It consists of areolar tissue with many fat cells. Lack of vital organs in the area make it ideal for subcutaneous injections with a hypodermic needle, and that's where that term comes from. Okay, this is where I'm actually going to end recording number 1, and I will pick up with recording number 2, which will include the various accessory structures.